All right then. So good evening. Hey everyone. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Let's have a look. Who's here? Well, I've got the great Chantel, David, Jake, and Laura, and Anchor, and I'm pleased as well. The whole game's back together. I looked away for a second, and then everyone just flooded in. So welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good week. It's certainly been eventful, hasn't it? Let's turn the things right up. Okay, so I'm going to get going in just a second. What I'm going to do is send over a document now before I forget, which is just useful again to Graham, what we're going to talk about today. So I don't forget to send it to you later. Okay, where is it? Sorry. It's over here. It's in this directory. It's in there, and we will send that off to the void. Okay, so I will just start with a bit of table setting before we get into today's topic, which is that I am working on the SharePoint just to give it a bit of a pizzazz. I think it's well overdue, a bit of a facelift. So the student section, that is the bit that we're going to be kind of looking at soon, is hopefully going to come together. It's something I've been working on, and I haven't really talked about it much, but just to tell you in advance that that is something that's being worked on. It's definitely in need of a dire shake-up. I think I can do a good job at giving it some love. Anyway, so we'll come back to that when we need to. It's still a couple of weeks away. But where we are is looking at actually, a topic which I'm going to preface because I'm talking about it tomorrow with those with me, which is this of cryptography. Yes, crypto. Really what it is, why it's important, and we can answer those two questions in exactly that order, I suppose. I want to start exactly with this, like, what is cryptography? If only because it's in the news and it's in the sciences so much. What we think about cryptography is the art of hiding, literally just obscuring and ideally protecting information. We're trying to hide us. It's the art of a science, and it is a science too, because there's some maths involved in this as well. But after all, it's pretty straightforward to manipulate characters and also in some way by either adding some constant number to them or maybe change them in some systematic manner. But ultimately, this is an art, and again, because doing so in such a way just to defend us, to put ourselves away from attacks is maybe not as easy as it might appear first. There's a lot of guesswork to this. There's an awful lot of calculation, as we're going to see as well, that needs to go into play to find what's known as a really strong, rock-solid cipher. You can't see me. What's going on? Do I not have a face? Let me turn that off and on again. That could be the case. All right, let's have a look. Night all, Laura. So if you're in the academy at all, these sessions are just meant to be open-ended, so that it's primarily about a wildcard. So this is kind of what Fridays are about. They're a bit more advanced if that's the case, but what we're going to go through is the art of obscuring information, and hopefully I'll walk you through it. Okay. In any case, cryptography, as it is, gives us the opportunity to have a basic level of security against a hacker or a bad person who might do bad things with that information. We usually contrast this in cipher information with information that's presented in a clear, plain text, which is to say there's no protection surrounding that at all. And that's generally considered better to protect information using cryptography than just have information freely, freshly available out there. What we want to do is actually just hide it in some shape or form. And the way we do that is with this. Now, a cipher, which is, we're going to start talking about cryptography sort of through history, will lead up to more modern forms of cryptography in a second. Again, these are all derived from ancient forms of cryptography, but underlying all of this is still a cipher, and that's one of the most fundamental forms of cryptography. And ciphers are really just algorithms, right? That's all they are. If you look at this, it's just a set of step-by-step instructions that are usually used to complete a task. And in the case of ciphers, there we go, sorry. Ciphers can be used also to send it this way, or maybe reverse it, to unobscure, to decipher the same information that was previously encoded or enciphered. So let's have a couple of looks, because there are many different types of ciphers out there, and they all have varying different levels of security potential to them. Some of the more ancient ones, perhaps the older ones that we're going to start with today, should be considered maybe to have no security potential out there at all, just today considering how easy they are to crack, But again, this leads into the more modern approach of cryptography, which is much more secure than these basic other ones to begin with. Okay, so let's have a look at the first one. Sorry if I'm looking to one side, it's just because the palm trees, could be the palm trees. Let me turn my face off, and then, oh, true, I don't have a face. What happened there? How bizarre. One second, let me see if I can change my face. Is it this? Nope, that doesn't work either. I'm just flicking through all the different types of cameras I have. I have a few. Okay, so let's try this one. Nope. Okay, let me just open that up. Sorry, I'm just getting through the types of cameras I have. Turn this on, select. How bizarre. Okay. Is that not working? Let me just, I'm going to leave the video and come back to it if I can. Sorry, I'm absolutely bizarre. Yeah. I would have thought that would work, because I have a face. It certainly says it works. Folks, am I here?
Yeah, good to see you now, Marco.
Okay, thank you. I'm not too sure what happened there. Sorry, folks. Okay. Well, thanks for letting me know, Chantel. What I am here, obfuscated behind this. What is of varying degrees? Well, let's start just by imagining this particular device. This might be familiar to some of you. We might be in possession of something like a cipher. Now, if you're maybe familiar with this one, it might be because you've seen the movie A Christmas Story from usually Christmas movie time. I'm going to put that one on, in which little Ralphie here, the character here, what he does is he obtains one of these ciphers, which is a little orphan Annie's secret society decoder pin. Okay. And so this decoder pin, as he has, is really just a set of numbers going sequentially through the alphabet, 1 all the way to 26, around the edge of the device there. And as he's listening on the radio, he's getting what a cipher is, and a set of letters that follow. These aren't presented in any particular order by the seams of things, really just around the outer edge. And so what would happen is the radio announcer would provide, he would set your pins to some form of combination. So he would line up one number with another number, and then it would read off some secret message that he's going to get to. Ostensibly, only individuals who possess this pin, or like in this case him, were distributed to children around the world, and then they could only decipher them by taking the numbers that were given over the radio and then transforming them back into the letters so that it makes sense.
She was almost there. I think I flew. My mind was a steel trap. Every pore vibrated. It was almost clear. Yes, 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 yes.
Be sure to drink your Ovaltine.
All right, so it's a little bit of an advert. after all that. Yeah, you betcha. Okay, so after all that, yeah, I know. Okay, so which is to say then that was the cipher that little Ralphie had there. And again, if I just have a look at the image, then it might be a bit difficult to see, but what you can see is that these letters and numbers that correspond to one another, such as that the letter L corresponds to the number 3, and then 4 corresponds to the letter M, based on again this particular setting of the decoder pin. So this is one such potential, what we're going to call a substitution cipher. If what we're doing is we're substituting a letter for a number, and that number again will henceforth represent that letter for the rest of the message for other such communication. So what's the problem with the cipher? I mean, generally, when you think about issues in computers and computer science, we always have hackers who are trying to get into a system or break a code or break in or hack into something, hack your password. But we sometimes frame this in terms of asking the question, like, what is the attack vector for us? What are they going to try to do? What's the vulnerability potentially here? And so in this case, it's really that anyone who has access to the same pin, who has this thing here, is then able to break any cipher that's made with this pin. Again, this pin was in the movie, it was given out, it was distributed, I think, in the 50s or the 60s or something, just the kids who were listening to the radio message, so it was pretty out there, okay? It was in the hands of many, many people, and so everyone who had access to that pin would be able to understand the message, so not that secure, okay? So this is when how we might frame this attack vector is the key, in this case, the pin. So we're going to call it key, again, for this purpose, just to be very prevalent. It's pretty well known how to use a key and how to manipulate the key. Since a lot of people have access to said key, it might not be the best use of a cipher. This is just one example. Okay, we have many different examples coming up that we could use. Just take another more straightforward one, perhaps with less, with less videos. This is when we imagine we have all the letters of the alphabet, and we're just going to assign the ordinal position of that letter as its cipher value. Okay, so again, with the secret society pin, and there was a random element to this, right? The letters were being skipped, perhaps, so there was a rhyme or reason to them, although the numbers at least were sequential. So what we'll do is we'll just line them up both. We're going to use these sequential letters up top, and then map them out to the sequential numbers at the bottom. So A becomes 1, B becomes 2, and so on. But both of these things are increasing linearly. Yeah, do you see where this is going? Again, you might remember as computer scientists, like we start ordinarily counting at 0 rather than counting at 1 because, here mapping of A to 1, Z to 26, it's just not much more familiar to us. Just instinctively assumes we think of this like this. So I want to keep it grounded in that discussion, even though, right now, it might be helpful to think about this too. But ordinarily, you might actually see this as a 0 all the way to 25. Okay, just 0 being A, 25 being Z in that case. But either way, like this would still work exactly the same as roughly being the same security potential as the secret society pin does. Why is that? Because we can actually make this a little bit easier for us if we are constantly increasing the letters. So A through to 20, A to Z. So 1 to 26. We could also, instead of just doing this direct mapping between the two, we could then rotate around. Now we could start 1 somewhere else as opposed to being A. And of course now instead of just having one cipher where A becomes A, 1 becomes A, B maps to B, 2, we have a variety of different ciphers at our disposal, depending on where we decide that we want to start. Where's our starting point? We can really choose anywhere we want to. And so, for example, we might actually do this. We might add 2 to every number. So instead of going up from 1 all the way to 26, as we said, where's my pen? Why don't we go instead from 3 to 28? Now think about it. If you're trying to break a cipher, you might see patterns like this, again with all the numbers in them. What might jump out at you? Again, well, if you're used to seeing ciphers that are going from 1 to 26, well, for example, something where you don't see any 1s or 2s, and suddenly you're seeing 27 and 28, potentially the message that might be long enough to have, in this case, Y's or Z's. It might seem to you that this is slightly off, and it is. Like, this cipher has just been shifted in some way. So instead of just being a straightforward line, there's a little bit of modification, a little bit of a workaround there has been made to it. So that could be a bit of a tip off if you're trying to defend against someone trying to figure this one out. So what else? Right, so yeah, instead of us going from 1 to 27 to 28 at the end, what we might do is we actually just might wrap around the alphabet. So that is, once we've exhausted all the 26 possible values that ended up with the letters, the 26 letters of the alphabet, we might instead, well, once we have X, well, say, instead of Y being 27 and Z being 28, why don't we make it 1 and 2? Now, this is not a massive improvement on the security of the cipher. Like, as I said, it's quite still fragile if it's quite easy to break at if only by human eyes alone. It doesn't give us that much of an edge, of a clue, I guess, to the potential adversary as to how to crack it, how to decipher the message. But better than nothing. Okay, so this could be done for, I guess, any different value, just to obtain any number of different ciphers. So instead of just going up by 2 positions, let's say, let's go up by 20. Just do every single letter's value, again, wrapping around the alphabet, so we exhaust it, we get back to 26, instead of having 27, 28, we could just come back to 1, reset, and then carry on. So our starting position could be anywhere we want to, but then we could actually add 26 to it. Now, this doesn't look all that different to what we had before. And this is where that vulnerability comes into play right now, quite obviously, because there's only 26 possible ways for us to rotate the alphabet while keeping, again, the order of the letters preserved, right? Unless we start skipping A and D and G and, then maybe just rearranging the other letters in some other way. If you're trying to keep everything straightforward in a line, again, linearly, wrapping around 26 when necessary, there's only 26 ways for us to do that, okay? So this is, again, just to say that, yeah, if we have a look at before and after, shifting 26 characters or shifting 0 really is exactly the same as shifting the alphabet followed by 0 times. So that's our limitation for this. We have a very small number of, again, this word keys. We have a small number of keys that can be used to decipher using this cipher. Okay. Now, this is an example of something that we might better know as a rotational cipher, and it was made rather famous again by Caesar, as better known as the Caesar cipher. It's attributed again to Julius Caesar, who was apparently more than just 2,000 years ago for him to encode the messages to his troops on the front line. And at the time, this was way out there. This was really a big deal. And generally, we're going to find that, again, with cryptography nowadays, with our modern technology, it's really just this pattern of breaking the mold and then doing something new and then trying to stay one step ahead always. And oftentimes, they'll catch up, and this cipher too, which again was once, lauded as being this wonderful thing, this amazing unbreakable cipher, clearly now it's no longer as strong as it used to be. And so now we have to keep ways of having to stay ahead and improve and get ahead of it. And, as for whatever kind of attack adversary that is, whatever the potential enemy on the battle line perhaps might have, as would have been the case with Julius Caesar, or whatever the hacker who's trying to break into your systems, as might be the case today. Unfortunately, again, we're not using Caesar cipher today to uncipher any of our information. That'd be a bad thing today. We're using much more modern techniques. But these modern techniques evolved again from seeing codes to being created, from ciphers to being created and then broken, and then having to be created anew to just try to defend us against much more new and school vulnerabilities that have been exposed. So yeah, like I said previously, it was very easy to decipher or track to make sense of the Caesar cipher, but again, it was like really difficult back then. So the limitation again was the limited amount of keys. There's only 26 of them for the alphabet for it to make sense. In the English alphabet, of course, if you're using a different alphabet, your number of keys might be a bit different if you're using the same rotational approach. But the fundamental limitation is still now you're confined to as many different letters in your alphabet that you might be using in order to encipher information. Okay, and I actually have a website here that makes good use of this example of this. So why don't I type in the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog? This is a very famous phrase in linguistics. It makes use of every character in the alphabet. But here, our key, being the key 1, is just going to basically shift this up by 1, I believe. There we go. So A becomes B, B becomes C, C becomes D. This website's quite good at visualizing or presenting that information. Albeit with Python, it looks like this. So we define the function, we accept the key. So key's going to be 1. We decide that here. Index plus the key, the alphabet, and then we actually have to get the alphabet twice over because we should be able to allow the rotation to happen beyond. So let's try something else. If I say not 1, but perhaps let's say 11, that would become A becomes L, B becomes M, and so forth. So we've essentially rotated. But like I said, it's not a good idea to have rotation 0 because you're essentially just starting at the same initial position, not really hiding or obfuscating information at all. Same would be for 26. Again, you've just gone full lap essentially. Limitation again, the number of keys. There's an in-joke amongst this, like rot 26 would be actually twice as strong as rot 13 because 13 times 2 is 26, so it sounds like it should be twice as strong, but we clearly know that's not it's not the case. Okay, so rot 13 would shift it by half the alphabet. Rot 26 would actually have no effect at all. So let's take it a step further. We've seen Caesar cipher, good for the day. What's an improvement that might be able to be made to Caesar? Now, this would lead us ideally to potentially this of the Vigenère cipher. So Caesar again has a limitation of that there's only one key and there's only 26 possible values for that key. So what the Vigenère cipher does is instead of using a simple key, it uses multiple keys. It uses many of them. Instead of having to pick a number to shift by, instead what we're going to do is we're going to define a keyword, and then that keyword, by using all the really combination of letters of that keyword in a sequence, so that as we go to change them up. Let me just find that. So the keys at the time haven't been inside. Instead, this time, what we might do is use a few keys. We might use a couple of keys, 5 keys in this case, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever many keys we want to, depending on the length of the keyword that we use. So if that keyword here is 5 letters long, then this keyword becomes the interesting twist that made the Caesar cipher, I guess, much more challenging for a hacker then just to be able to crack, because it's got so many different keys to lock with. So I want to go through an example of how it works, because I think it makes more sense to just see this more visually rather than describing verbally. Okay, so what we do here is we encrypt a message like hello, Hello, and I'm going to use the keyword here, law. So LAW, seems like a simple one. So if our message was hello, in what we could have otherwise called, that's our plain text, because it's visible for us to see, then that is going to be our keyword. Okay, so this isn't clear. It's not enciphered. We haven't obfuscated it yet. It's not hidden against anyone at all. And our key is going to be law, 3-letter. And so how we might do this then? Oh, what happened? Come back. It is. I think sometimes it helps again, just especially when you're trying to encipher or decipher using the Vigenère cipher, again, just to consider all the different inputs that go into determining the final output character. So we're going to look at the plain text, and we're going to convert that, just like we did with Caesar, to the ordinal position. So we're going to see where in the alphabet is that, which order is it in the alphabet. Is it the first letter? Okay, well, if it's 1. If it's the last letter, it's going to be 26, and so on. Yeah, so A is B, A is 1, B is 2. If we're going to do the exact same thing with each letter of the keyword, and so what we'll do is we're going to look at the keyword, law in this case, and then we're going to figure out what the letter's numerical correspondence would be. And then what we're going to do is add those two things together. So if we go over 26, we would actually, just like we did with Caesar cipher, we're going to wrap around again, such as that we're confining ourselves to that range of 1 till whatever. And so we're going to take that number and transform it into a letter. So for example, if the result was 2, then we're going to change that into a B. And for that reason, that is the B is the second letter in the alphabet. So let's walk through again. Hello is being our plain text, and law being our key there. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. Our plain text of the first letter of that would be the ordinal position of H, would be the 8th letter of the alphabet. That's the hat. We do the same thing again for L. So L, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, that's 12. That's the 12th letter of the alphabet. So 8, and that's 12. So our next step would actually be to add those two values together. 8 plus 12 together, that gives us 20. And so we get 20. And we don't need to wrap around in this case. We didn't get over 26 with the alphabet, so we're still okay in that sense. The 20th letter of the alphabet is T, if you figure this out. So the first step of enciphering the process again of hello, using the Vigenère cipher, again, that would be using the key L, would be to turn the H into, squiggle, into 20. Into a T. The 20th cardinal position of that. Okay? And so, again, we can do this all over again. We can look at the E, the second letter of the plain text, H-E. And then the same idea, we use the second letter of the keyword now. So we're not using the same key. We're actually not using 12 over and over and over again. Actually, we're using a different key this time. Now this time we're using A. So that's A, the second letter of our keyword, whose ordinal position, A, would be 1. So then 5 plus 1 gives us 6. And that results in A, B, C, D, E, F, G, F, 6. Okay? So that would be 6 in that case. Just to run stuff. Okay, so the next letter, we use the first L of hello. So L, and the W from law. So just use another color. So L is going to be 12, and the 23rd letter is going to be that of W, and we add those things together. This time we have 35. This is different. That's not a legal value in terms of our cipher, because remember, we can find only from 1 all the way to 26. That's what we have at disposal. And so what we'll do is we'll just subtract 26 from this. So 35 minus 26, that gives us 9, and then 9, and that gives us I. Okay, so what do we do? Well, because we exhausted our keyword, 1, 2, 3, but we still have more plain text to get going. I mean, there's still these two remaining, the case of these two, in the plain text we need to encipher. So what we might expect then is the next logical thing is just to go back to the beginning of the keyword and continue on. And so we'll do that. And this is where it gets cool, because despite L being the same in the word hello, we'll use the second L this time, the second L of our plain text, and the first L. We would expect the results to be the same in the Caesar cipher, but now, again, because we exhausted all the letters of our keyword, we had to go back to the beginning, L for law, 12 plus 12 is 24, and 24 would be X, that's the 24th letter of the alphabet X. And lastly, we do the final thing as well for O, advancing it in one position, because the A in law, so 16, and that's P. All right, so that leaves us then with this jumbled up nonsense, which sounds like this. Okay, ultimately then, hello, in this case, just becomes a random set of characters pronounced suffixed. And so immediately some advantages might jump out at you. Again, with the Caesar cipher we just looked at to start with, anytime that we change a letter with Caesar cipher, it was always going to be the same letter again and again and again, as we saw with the enciphered message. So if you had B and we're advancing, maybe like 2 characters, well, every B in the original message would always be a D, because D always comes 2 letters after B. That's always going to be the case. So again, if our Caesar cipher is 2, our key is 2 in the Caesar cipher, every time we see a B, it becomes a D. Every time we have an A, it becomes a C, and so forth. But at least here with the Vigenère cipher, it's a bit different, because we have different keys. We have a keyword, and we have different keys, and that means we're rotating our keys a bit differently. Depending then on which key of the keyword we might use and which letter of the plain text we're currently on and so forth, that explains then why those 2 letters, those 2 L's weren't the same, right? Instead of H-E-L-L-O, we don't have some mapping then. Those 2 L's in the middle of hello, I think they would turn out to be I and X. So they're not the same character as we would expect with the Caesar cipher. And so this already is we've given ourselves a leg up. It's already a better cipher compared to the Caesar cipher. So let's go for hello. And our cipher text will be law. Oh, this is cool. You can even throw in more alphabets to your soup. Do I need to hit enter or something? Sorry, I'm new to this website. I found it 5 minutes before we started, so I don't know where exactly to begin there. But the point is very much the same. Yeah, with Caesar then, because it was much more secure when you consider just how many more keys are available to you. With the Caesar cipher, initially we only had 26 characters available to us. With the Vigenère cipher, though, we have, 26 to the N keys, where N is really just the length of our keyword. So, for example, if we're using a 2-letter keyword, like, for example, AA or AB or whatever else, all the way up, that leaves us with 26 squared, which is, let's have a look. 26 to the power of 2 is 676 possibilities. So, again, that's much more than 26. And if I wanted to extend these to perhaps 3 letters now, let's go back. 26 to the power of 3. Oh, so up to 17,000, and even 4 and 5 and so forth. We're getting more and more possibilities for this. And so as we start to increase the number of possibilities, we start to then increase the difficulty, I suppose, for the hacker, for the adversary to figure out what the key actually is. And that's really what the goal of cryptography ultimately is, right? We want to be able to protect information, and at the same time we want to be able to defend that information that's from being determined by bad people. So the more work that we put into making the challenge more challenging, to make the more challenging keys, the more likely we are then to be successful in order to repel and cipher information. So again, a Vigenère cipher, it's a much more secure cipher than Caesar, but it's still not secure. Okay, it's definitely not a cipher that I would encourage you to use today, because there are computer programs that are, software that I just saw online that's capable of figuring this out and doing this pretty easily. So how to decipher then using the Vigenère cipher pretty well as well. But again, it's still more secure than Caesar, because for sure, the changing alphabet and it's much larger use of keys. So again, let's go back to that decoding from a moment ago and think again another potential problem that we have. So just assuming then that your hacker is not actually a member of your secret Illuminati society, yeah, they don't actually have this pin, that's already a step up. If they don't have the pin, because at least previously we assumed that anyone who had the pin could actually crack this, and that's still true. But let's assume that your hacker, lucky you, they don't have the pin. At least we have that in our favor. Is there another way around that they would be able to crack the code without the pin? Think about that for a second. If someone who just saw the information, think about the characteristics of the English of the language, and that might suggest people figure out what the cipher is. You might be able to think about some unique features of the English alphabet, which is like 1-letter words. I know in English we have a couple of those 1-letter words. If you know, call them out in chat, links among you. So what things might appear in English that are sort of telltale signs or giveaways? Yeah, not artificial intelligence, but the indefinite articles of a and like a thing or I have, etc. I think they appear by themselves, right? So if you see a single letter word in a message, and I think this is rather telling if you've seen the imitation game, yeah, depending on the number of characters in the pin, we are limiting ourselves right to 1 to 26, but the number of letters that we can perhaps remove from the equation. So let's say if you have seen a single letter word in a message, in a book or a message perhaps, you're probably going to guess then that it's either going to be the letter I, and every time you see that character, or A, one or the other, and every time then you see that character, A or I, or that number that might be associated with that, I'm going to assume that's an I. Or let's say, just out of, let's say this is 100, let's say that's 200. Doesn't matter what numbers we end up choosing, but as long as we have consistency with them, I'm going to assume then that if I ever see the number 200, it's going to be an I, or 100 might be an A, and so forth. And then I'm going to try to plug in that A into everywhere else. That actually was the giveaway if you've seen the imitation game with What's his face? Doctor Strange. So a bit of trial and error actually ended up happening, and that might reveal, like I said, some patterns. So what we're trying to make is see what telltale signs might emerge from this. Not a full giveaway, but being able to extract relevant information, which then is really helpful if you want to run that through some linguistic analysis. And let me just close my door, sorry, it's really annoying me. This was a really cool module I did with linguistics, where we had to examine patterns of language and in English, like put them under a microscope and notice what frequency they appear with. You're talking about what's it called, Wordle? I love Wordle. They actually started appearing now with the LinkedIn too, which I saw. So,
no, it's called cryptogram.
I'm curious. I love that kind of
It's
stuff.
just a funny get the game up now on my iPhone, but it's basically substitution cipher cracking.
Is it this one? Oh, it's popular.
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, this is right up your street. We should all start to live. So you start with the message, and then you have to work out by deduction, really, what's missing.
Yeah, you start working out which number relates to which character and start building the words up. And pattern recognition, if you see, say, 3, 12, 18, 3, the four-letter word, and start at the end of the same, the odds are in the English language it's that.
So smaller words are always easy to work with. If 4, 3,
Yeah.
definitely here I can see the CJ appearing.
Yeah, I mean, when you get like a 12 to 20 character word, it's a lot harder, but you don't look at the message, you find the small words first, because they're much easier to judge based on the pattern of the numbers.
Oh, this is like a wordy Sudoku, in a way.
Yeah.
Because I can see that so 2 has appeared here. Wait, does that make sense? No, that can't be right. Tweet?
Yeah, but I find, easy most popular, but, you sometimes get some sentences with very few easy.
It's just that they've this person put the wrong character in. To be or not to be. Okay. I might not know that. It's a fun time game. That kind of thing. This again, proof in the pudding that it's not even that difficult or kind of trivial if you can just make a game out of this. Something that only relies on a few limited set of characters that they do appear with regular frequency, you might be able to then extract information from this and then start to build a bigger picture around that too. So this is true if, like you said, smaller words first and then you work your way up. Given that and this is true in text, in kind of any arbitrary text in English language, the distribution of letters of that text actually follow what we see on screen here. This pattern roughly meaning that, say, roughly given any point in time, say about 13% of the time, it's going to be an E. So any letter, if you pick one out at random from what I'm talking about right now, it's going to be the letter E. And only say, 1 out of 100 times, is that right? Will be 1 out of 1,000 times will be the letter Z. So a tenth of 1% will be a Z, and so forth, and so forth and so forth. Okay, so these are some letters again that would appear much more frequently. Vowels amongst them, A, E, I, O, U. There are other letters that don't appear very frequently. And so this is still a problem in the generic substitution cipher, even with the letters being a bit scrambled up, because it seems at first blush to be perhaps a bit more secure than one where the letters are still increasing sequentially, and the numbers are increasing sequentially too. Even when with this scattershot mapping of letters to numbers, as long as we're still confined to these two domains of we have A to Z and 1 to 26, there's always going to be a mapping between them, because whether they're ordered or not, it's still a problem. There's still going to be a mapping in the English language anyway. Because again, of frequency analysis, there's still going to be some telltale signs in this, and they're actually very common puzzles. Like Dave's game amongst them, we might find it a bit tedious to try to solve this puzzle, but otherwise that is well known as a cryptogram. You may, if the puzzling type, try those games, and it's definitely that is across all messages that would appear in the English language. That's the case. There are plenty of other ciphers that appear that are used as well today that are more secure than any of those ones, and that we might call them, because those are examples of what we call one-to-one ciphers, because they're mapping a single character to a different character onto a number, and those are ciphers then that are just substituting pairs or triples of characters at a time. And again, these ciphers form the basis of what eventually becomes modern cryptography, which we're going to get into in just a moment, okay? Now, there are examples of transposition ciphers, where instead of substituting one character for another character, we simply use an algorithm to rearrange the letters in some systematic way. And so the effect there is that all the letters of the original plain text message, they're still there, but all we need to do is unscramble them somehow. And because there's an algorithm that was used to scramble them in the first place, there's got to be a way to undo that somehow. Well, with a bit of trial and error, we can probably sort that out as well. We can definitely find the curve. And finally, I think the most egregious issue with all the classical ciphers is, how do you get the key? How do you distribute that key? How do you tell someone who you want to share information with? How do you tell your ally what the key is for the cipher that you are going to be able to use in the real world? Now, we can't encrypt the key because, think about it, if you encrypt the key, how are they going to know what the real key is? If you send them a message and then they don't know how to interpret that message, or they see it and they interpret it as something else, that's not going to be helpful to you. So you want them to see it in plain text. You want them to see your key in the clear, so to speak, rather. You want them to just have it. So you don't want to encrypt that as you hand it to them, which wouldn't do any good. Okay. But if you're giving the key to your ally, and again your hacker friend or your adversaries within earshot of that transaction, or they have access to that same piece of paper, because again your ally might have carefully or not very consciously thrown it away, or somehow picked it up. Now all of a sudden, all your messages are going to be back to using the same basic ciphers, which are fairly insecure. Just to say, take a step forward again with modern cryptography. Perhaps you've seen a screenshot like this at some point in your life and you're trying to get into some kind of system. Enter your email and we'll email you a link to change your password. Well, why don't you just email me my password? Like, okay, you're going to give me a link to go and change it? You must know it, then, my password. If I then use my credentials, my username and my password, in order to log into your service at any given day. But okay, I guess, sure. Well, yeah, the reason is, it's because of security, and there's a good reason for it. So let's distinguish ciphers, which we've been talking about, from that of hashes. When it comes to authenticating ourselves, we actually don't want the people to store our passwords. So I think one of the most critical distinctions is that ciphers, the ones we just saw, they are reversible. Yes, so you can undo what we just did. We can basically just mirror this. The whole reason why it's important to share it with your allies is that there's keys. But what I'm telling you is that these hashes, they're not reversible. Or certainly, they shouldn't. They're not supposed to be reversible, okay? So as it turns out, And we'll see about this in a bit. When you go into log into some service, whatever that is, whatever website you go to, if that service is doing, if they're doing a good job of protecting your data, the reason they can't just send your password to you is because they actually don't know your password. They don't know your password. Seems a bit strange because clearly, like, there must be something. If I type in my password, if I go to Gmail or whatever.com and I get logged in, I must have proven something. I must have authenticated myself, as Anka says. But a good service then is one that doesn't store your password in the database. That is a good thing if you think about it. We don't want them to store that because in the case of there ever being a data breach, you wouldn't want your password to be in their database. So don't store them. Instead, what they do is they store a hash of your password in the database. And when you provide your password to them, you say, hey, have this thing, they're going to run what we provide to them through the same hash function. Kind of our input goes into the function, and then what comes out of that is going to be the same output of a hash function. And the hash function, again, is just this generic idea for a function that takes in any arbitrarily sized or any large or small amount of data, and this is always going to map that out to some other finite range or other set of values. So I'm making a point of this to say that this might be this long, it could be this long, it could be this long, it could be any arbitrary long size of information, it could be some fixed string where if I run my password through this, I'm always going to get out, like, say 20 characters or 15 characters or 10 characters. But this hash output, the hash derivation, as it's also known, it actually looks nothing like my input, my original password. My password was, I don't know, doggos with like 100 Gs, okay? Doggos. It will always come back with whatever weird kind of characters that might result from this. It will look nothing like it. So this hash function performs some weird manipulations to this. And this is what I want to get into, okay? That's what happens when you log into systems that are more generally is that you will log into some service, you'll type in your password. When that information is then submitted to that server, to that organization to check your login credentials, to authenticate you, what they'll do is they'll run your password, whatever we've submitted to the form, through that same hash function again. And again, if that value matches what they have in their database for you, well, that's how they know. That's how they know that you provided the right credentials. Because there's some matching or some mapping of your password to the one that they stored, but they're not actually checking your password, your actual password, the hash function itself. And that would probably give you some sense of security. You know, and again, this is to say that if you ever use a service where they end up having to click on that link and they actually do send you that password, not a good idea. You know, you probably don't want to use that service anymore because they're not taking strong protection to protect your data. They're not doing it in plain text. So as I said, like once we have a password stored in the database, it's actually stored as a hash rather than the password itself. That service shouldn't be able to tell you what your password really is. No one should know, hopefully. So this idea of a hash function, like what actually is it? Well, like I said, this is something that would take in any arbitrary data, and eventually we'll get into hashing things like files, not just words or strings, but right now let's just keep it to strings. So strings is, I think we've talked about this before, like a kind of sequence of characters or letters, like a word or a phrase in a sentence, and what we're trying to do is map that onto some other range. So we'll start then just by mapping a string, or like a set of characters or letters, to a number. But it could be, again, to a different string, it could be a string that's always 10 characters long, and so on. So there are some properties that a good hash function should have. So let's have a look at what they are, yeah? To begin with, they should only use the data being hashed. Okay, they shouldn't be anything else that comes into play, like they shouldn't be bringing in some outside information. Let's say you should really just rely exhaustively on whatever data is being passed into that hash function. It should also use all the data that's being hashed. It becomes a bit less effective if every time I provide a word or a string to my hash function, I'm only using the first character of that string or the first bit of it. Such as that my hash function for every word or every string I provide that starts with an A is always going to return the same value. Like that's not very useful to me. I want to get a better distribution of my value, so use the whole thing. It should always be deterministic. And so when I say deterministic, I mean there's as yet no random elements to this. So oftentimes we think that random numbers are just a nice way to jumble things up. But the problem is that if we want to hash functions in our story to always output the same value for those inputs. So look, if I give you this thing, okay, and I hash it and I get some outputs, every time I provide you this thing, every time I give you my password and run it through the same hash function, I want to then get the same output every time, deterministically. And so that's what websites rely on. That's what KMS is. That's what being able to use hashed passwords as part of credentialing check is. That's what authentication is. They're relying on the fact that they will always get the same output given the same input. So that's the requirement of the hash function. And they should always uniformly distribute the data as well. So sometimes you'll see mapping of these strings to say some set of values, and those could be numbers again, those could be strings. You want to spread those out evenly, ideally, across all the different possible values that you might have. You don't want everything to just hash to 15 if your value is 1 to 100. Okay? You ideally want everything to be spread out in such a way that there's like an equal number of zeros and ones and twos and threes and 99s and so on, as we talked about a bit before when we discussed hash tables. Finally, we also want to be able to generate very different hash codes, very different values for similar data. So hello and hellos should actually map to very different values, even if there's like an S or plural S at the end. This will be ideal if like a tiny bit of variation, just a little bit of a change, would have a really big dramatic ripple effect. And almost creating this, this dramatic ripple effect is pretty important when you're talking about cryptographic hash functions, which we'll get into in a second, which forms the basis of almost everything, which form the basis of everything we do, or we rely on them when it comes to security in the field of cloud. Okay, it's always going to be relying on these hash functions being really, really, really good at making small changes that have huge consequential dramatic ripple effects in the hash code or the hash value, the data that comes out of the hash function, let's say. So after all this talk, I think about good hash functions, let's take a look at the bad ones. Yeah, we'll talk about why. So we'll talk about some of its virtues, but some of the potential problems as well. So instead, let's add up all the ordinal positions of all the letters of the hash string. So this ordinal position is exactly the same as before when we had a moment ago when we were talking about Caesar and Vigenère. So A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, and so on. And for example, so like say the word like star, if we wanted to add up all the ordinal positions of the letters of that word, so we have STAR, that's I don't know what numbers they are exactly, but add them up together and you get 58. So what is a good thing about this hash function? Well, it's that it's not reversible. Like me looking at this, I can't tell you. If I get 58, I don't necessarily know, you know what I mean, that this came from star. I don't know if it was 55 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, or 50, well, something else, plus, or rats, for example. With rats, then, like, the order of the key matters too. That's kind of, there we go. For example, like, it could be a whole variety of things. And for rats, it could have been that, or swap, or pause, or wasp, or mull, or all these whole random set of bees in a row. So all these things then, to be fair, like when you run through this terrible hash function that I've defined here, all these things are going to always add up to 58. So when I follow the same rules of the algorithm, I never really know what my input was given my output. Okay, my output is 58. That is a good thing. Like, that is what a hash function should do. Hash functions, unlike ciphers we saw at the beginning, they should not be reversible. I don't know what went into this to arrive at 58. But the problem is, folks, is that we have a lot of collisions. As Chantal pointed out, like, there are so many different things that do map up to 58. And so we were talking about collisions a bit previously. We were talking about them in the context of a hash table. And collisions were okay in the context of that context. We were clustering things together. If they all happen to have the same hash value, we'll just put them into the same bucket. But it's not nice in the world of cryptography. When we start to rely on cryptography to keep our data secure, we do not want to have collisions at all. In fact, pretty much we rely on the fact that it is mathematically so unlikely, nigh on impossible to have a collision in order to make these things work. We rely on this to be the case. So collisions, when we're talking about cryptographic hash functions, are definitely not a good thing. A big, big no. All right, so just to recap, just to check that a user gave us the correct password, if I'm a website, what I'm doing as a website is I'm storing the hash of the password in my database versus just storing the password in a plain text file in the database, which hopefully no one is storing a plain text password in the database. Like, nowadays, that is simply not okay, yeah? What we do is we run the actual password, the real password, through that same hash function. We get a hash value as an output, some string or some number of what you have as the output, and if you get a match, if they're the same, odds are then they've entered the right password. Now, I'm saying odds are because we can't be 100% sure, and with everything, we can't ever be 100% sure. Like, we can be really sure. There's always just that teeny tiny chance of a collision, this corner case there where, even with the very best designed hash functions, like even the best designed cryptographic hash functions, there is always a teeny tiny chance of a collision, but ideally that chance is quite, negligible. It's like very unlikely. But it's good enough for our case. So odds are that if you get this hash, it comes out with this hash function. It's quite likely, 99.99999 plus, that they enter the right password, the correct password. That is in fact the users whose credentials are being verified, who we should then log them into, authenticate them for. Okay, I think that'd be a good point then to take a bit of a pause there to check if you're with me on board. So let's do that. I think Jake's on the bell there. It'd be a good point to maybe take a pause before we go any further. My goal is to ideally get to a point where we can talk about the crypto and the blockchain technology. So we'll talk about Bitcoin a bit later, but I think just to get us a bit of a breast. Why don't we do that, Jake? You're right. All right, good times. Yeah, let's get back into the swing of things, shall we? Yeah, I've got a little bit to cover. I'm not too sure if I can get through the whole heaps and mounds today, but it would be nice to get through to a topic that's coming up more and more these days, which is out of Bitcoin and the network. So let's see if we can make a good effort trying to get through the content. If not, I might push it back a week, so just so we can spend enough time going through this. But in any case, what we said is we've seen the model that's being used in KMS in order to run hash functions. Because modern cryptography, what we use nowadays, it's just hashing. That's all it is. Like, it's just hashing that's a bit more clever. Something that the example we just talked about moments ago has a bit more to it. But also, the algorithms tend to not to work on just a character-by-character basis. It's the algorithm that we just did as well, where I was adding up every single letter. I was looking at each one individually. They tend to take, these modern algorithms, they tend to get clusters of letters one at a time. So this time they do pairs or like triples and so on at a time. Maybe they do even more things. They might then rearrange the letters before just to do things to them. And so there's multiple layers going on with these modern encryption algorithms that we might not realize. And so unlike the ones we discussed earlier, most of these also have the property where, given the data's an arbitrary size, now we've really started to expand into our minds, not into just words or strings, but also images and files and videos and documents and PDFs and so on. Pretty much anything can be run through a hash function to arrive at a value, anything. But we're always going to get a string of bits, like a bit string, that is always exactly the same size, ultimately. So depending on the algorithm we choose, maybe it's going to be a 160-bit long string or a 256-bit long string, but our range then is finite. It's always going to be exactly 256 bits. But the combination of those bits obviously will be ideally different for every single piece of data that we might throw at it, no matter what. And so let's then expand our definition of this hash function and apply that into this idea of a cryptographic hash function. So what properties should that then have? Like, they should then be really difficult, very difficult, basically impossible to reverse. Like, it should be computationally impossible for anyone to undo that encryption. Like, that's pretty much the same as a regular hash function, but we're just, again, hammering the point home when we say this here. Okay? It should be really difficult to undo. They should still be deterministic. We don't want any random elements to do them. We still want a hash value to always get the same output, no matter what it is we run through the value to get the same hash function as a arbitrary number of times. And they should still generate very different hash codes for the similar data. So we still want things to be spread out, and we still want minor changes for them to have that dramatic effect. And they should never, and again, this is one of those words that computer scientists love, like, it should never allow two sets of data to hash to the same value. Now, do you see the potential problem when we frame it this way? Like, when we say they should never be able to do that, like, we've already restricted ourselves to a finite domain, right? Like, I said a moment ago that maybe this hash function maps to 160 bits or 256. Like, there's only so many combinations that you can get out of this if it's finite. Now, that might be an unfathomably large number, but the word never, it's a bit dangerous. So we can't really rely on this, and we'll see why that actually might potentially be a problem. This static length, by the way, is usually referred to as a digest in this context. So when we started to talk more about cryptographic or modern cryptography techniques, the output of a cryptographic hash function is usually referred to that of a digest. So let's take a look at some of those hash functions themselves. Perhaps you've already come across these, and I'm certainly not going to dive into the maths behind them tonight, but I wouldn't be able to explain that. I wouldn't be able to do it justice if I tried to explain the mathematics behind it. But just to look at some of the basics of this, SHA-1. Well, SHA-1 was quite a famous algorithm. It was designed by the NSA back in the mid-90s just to protect us, I guess. And again, these are really, really smart people who were tasked with working with things like military intelligence, people whose careers have dedicated their lives to protecting data as best as they actually can. So far more brilliant minds than I am, and for sure. So this hash function, and there was a published paper, which again, hash functions tend to be published papers, they tend to be kind of out there. Actually, it's quite a strange dichotomy because you actually describe in the paper exactly how the hash function works. You can go online, you one Google search away, but it should still be irreversible, and this really becomes a question of how incredibly complicated mathematics gets, because such as that even if you knew so many of the pieces going on, you might still not, you wouldn't be able to undo it, even if you tried. It's actually kind of amazing how that even works. And so SHA-1 digests are always going to be 160 bits in length. And so this is one of those I just mentioned a moment ago. That means that there are 2 to the 160 different SHA-1 digests, which is a bit over 10 to the 40th power. And again, so 2 to the 160 means that for every one of those 160 bits, there can either be a 1 or a 0. So we have that. Okay, we have 2 options times 2 options times 2 options times 160 times. So just try to make it fathomable, just to understand how large of a number this is, how crazy this is. Let me try and paint a picture for you, okay? So imagine then that you're looking at Earth. And let's say that I'm telling you, you need to find a specific grain of sand on Earth. I've not been on this in ages. Let's have a look. All right, so here's the planet. Find me a specific grain on the planet. And this is by far, again, much easier to try to have SHA-1 to have a collision where 2 values could actually map to the same thing. So that's about 10 to the 18 grains of sand on Earth. So that's 8 quintillion. I actually had to look up that word. Okay, so 8 quintillion grains of sand, which is way, way easier to find a grain of sand on Earth than it is to have a collision, okay? And in fact, if we go even further than this and say, imagine that every single one of those grains of sand on Earth was another planet, was another Earth. Okay, so every single grain on Earth of sand on Earth itself was another planet Earth, each of which had sand on it. So you might have 8 quintillion planet Earths, and you're still trying to find a specific grain of sand on each of those 8 quintillion planets. That is still easier than trying to have a collision with SHA-1. Like, it is mind-bogglingly big. But still, it's such an important algorithm that is actually one of the algorithms that is required, again, by the Fed and regulations used by government, I guess, to encrypt information. There are others too, as well, but SHA-1 was, it was initially listed by NIST as the standard algorithm by the National Institute for Standards and Technology. But there's a problem, folks, that even despite all this, it ain't good. It's broken. And this is because there was a clever website here called Shattered, so shattered.io. We have broken it. Yeah. So there was a research team, if I remember rightly. These people here, they actually figured out how to create a collision, like intentionally create a collision. And intentionally creating a collision has the effect of basically saying, well, it's broken. Like, they have proven that the digest can be the same. If there was a way for you to systematically generate collisions, well, that's bad. Okay, we'll see why that's bad in a second, but you can go to this URL here, shattered.io, and just to read a bit about how to do it, explain it in different levels. So again, if you really want to dive into the technology and the mathematics behind this, you're certainly welcome to. If you just want to understand it at a base level and why this is a problem, I would definitely encourage you to have a look at this website and read more about this. So what they did, so what they said was this. I'm just taking it again from their website. Here, okay? So I'm just reading. It is now practically possible to craft 2 colliding PDF files and obtain a SHA-1 digital signature on the first PDF file, which can then also be used as a valid signature on the second PDF file. So basically, in short, like what they're saying here is that they want to create 2 PDF files, and in such a way that if I run through the SHA-1 algorithm, its digest can result to be the same. Why is that potentially bad? Why is that potentially bad? For example, by crafting the 2 colliding PDF files as 2 rental agreements with different rents, it is possible to trick someone to create a valid signature for a high rent contract by having him or her sign a low rent contract. So if you can take a PDF and you can twist that into anything you want it to be, but have a valid signature, a valid SHA hash associated with it, that's not great. Like, before alarm bells start going off, because again, SHA-1 is still today used quite extensively, like even now. This shattered research, it was developed in 2017, it was released some time ago, but SHA-1 is still being used even now, even then. Again, before you panic, like, it's not been broken that many times. Although they did, they worked, I think, for a couple of years after, just to create this this collision. So 2017 onwards, and they do demonstrate the method on how to do it too. It's just not happened that many times. Cryptographic hash functions, once they've demonstrated one collision, technically it's broken. That is certainly true. But are the actual effects, I don't think they've really yet materialized. The computational power to create this is well beyond the capabilities of most people, what we have at our disposal, most syndicates even. So there's no cause for alarm yet. But it is just research, again, proving that there is a limitation, there is a problem with SHA-1. And we still always want to be, staying one step ahead with cybersecurity, just like when Julius Caesar's enemies figured out how to crack his Caesar cipher. The goal was we need to be one step ahead. As technologists, as people who want to stay one step ahead, we're doing our best job then at architecting and protecting our data. And so as architects here, we want to make sure that we're doing our best possible job of protecting our clients' data or our company's data against potential attacks. So as I mentioned, there are other standards today that are used by organizations, including the Fed, including KMS too. Like SHA-1, as I mentioned, is just one of the different options that you can choose in KMS. SHA-2 and SHA-3 are tougher, okay? They use more bits, basically, they digest. So instead of it being 160 bits, you can have anywhere between 220 and 500 or so bits. So way larger of a domain, even again, reducing still the likelihood of a collision to that much more, even grains of sand within grains of sand within grains of sand. Again, just imagine how unlikely it was with 2 to the power of 160, which is what we use for SHA-1. to the 8 quintillion and such, whatever that is, and now if we make it much more so, 2 to the power of 500, that is an impressive number. I don't have to pronounce that much, okay? So unfathomably large, very difficult to get to duplicate. MD5 and MD6 are other ones I've highlighted too. You might also hear these as well. In particular, I've highlighted MD5 because it's not actually considered secure anymore, but it's still very, very commonly used as a checksum. Basically, what we do is when we run a file through MD5, and say like we're a distributor of a file, and we want people to come to download my file, my source, yeah? We want to be able to show with a fingerprint that there's trust. We might run a file through an MD5 and say, look, if you've run a file through MD5, and the hash value will be blah, 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 and then other people can download that file and also run it through MD5, this cryptographic hash function. Again, this is usually a program that's available on most computers today just to run arbitrary data through as an input like a file, perhaps. And what we get out of that is a hash result or a checksum, and they can check, okay, well, the hash value that I received out of this is matching the hash value that I was told I was receiving. And if that's the case, I will trust that because they both match up. Versus perhaps getting that software from, some corner of the internet and then you don't really trust it so much. If you find the MD5 to be different, if it doesn't match, if it doesn't match what we downloaded, what you thought would be from that same file, well, that's probably a sign then that something has changed, something's been modified that you don't really want it to. So you might want to be a bit skeptical about trusting that file rather than just, diving into it, shall we say, yeah? So what do we do that relies on cryptography on the internet today? Just using our computers every day, what is it that we can see examples of this? Email. Email relies pretty much all the way through on cryptography, particularly when we start to use secure email services like, of which Gmail might not be considered one, but there are still services out there like, for example, ProtonMail and others that do encrypt email completely from point to point. That's much safer in terms of protecting one's own communications. So similarly, you might, this was in use, you might be familiar with Signal. So that's used to encrypt between two people over the texting sense, over the network, rather than the email, internet, and the like. Okay, so what else? Secure web browsing, like you might be familiar again with the distinction between HTTP, HTTPS, and if you're not, that's okay, but we're going to be talking about it a bit later on as well. But just you want to make sure that your web traffic is encrypted against people who are just able to monitor the network for all kinds of network traffic that's going by. So you probably don't want your searches to be on someone else's fodder for entertainment, shall we say. A VPN. So again, if you use a VPN, that's a good thing to do if you're traveling, for example. You may be on a less secure network. You might find yourself, your business at your home and your some other institution, for example, and VPNs allow you to encrypt information or communications within a network, and so allowing the network to pretend to do something on your behalf so that your web traffic cannot be read back to you directly, which could be an advantage in some situations as well. And document storage as well, S3. So if you use Dropbox, for example, generally what Dropbox is going to do is just break your document into little pieces and encrypt those pieces. S3 does that too. So rather than just storing the whole file, writ large in some server out there on the cloud, S3 will encrypt it before it sends it over to you, and so you can have some comfort in knowing that your data is being protected by those cloud servers. And so we're going to talk about that more in a bit, like how that can be used. A bit, of course, these hash functions and these cryptographic hash functions are really, really good. They're documented well, and then there's only one. There's only one version of SHA-1. There's only one version of SHA-3. And that is a limitation. Like, it might not be a severe one because it is pretty strong. They're pretty strong algorithms, but there are always ways that you can improve your cryptographic hash techniques if you're trying to protect data that we are receiving, data that we're sending, and so on. And that leaves us again with this idea of public key cryptography, of public and private key of asymmetric encryption, let's say, yeah? So you might hear these terms used interchangeably, that's fine, but we'll start by thinking about public key cryptography or asymmetric key cryptography by way of an analogy. I hate these words. So we're going to go back to arithmetic and algebra days here. So imagine if you have something like this. So 14 times 8 gives us 112. So multiplication, in that case, we can think of that as our function. I mean, it is a function, right? So if 14 is our input and our function is times 8, the result of which is going to be 112. Now, so multiplication is not a hash function. Why? Because it is reversible. So I can take that 112 we just saw, and I can multiply that by 1/8. Now, or equivalently, divide that by 8, and we still get back that original input. So while multiplication is a function, it is not a hash function because it is reversible. If we multiply any number x by some other number y, we get a result z. So what I'm saying is that we can undo that, the whole process, by taking z. We as long as we multiply it by 1 over y, or the reciprocal of y, and getting back the original x, it's reversible. It goes in both directions, yeah? So let's take this function and kind of obscure this. We know for ourselves that this function I'm using here is n times 8, yeah? So whenever I pass it in, it's going to be multiplied by 8. We know this. But I don't tell you what that is. I don't tell my friends what that is. I just say, hey, if I want to send me a message over the internet, just run it through this function here. Just run it through the function. So again, we're going to use just math as an example here. If my message is 14, I might say f of 14 is 112. That's what we can think of as equivalently being our public key. So you might say, having gone through this whole example, well, it's pretty easy to undo this. Yeah, and if I know then that 14 is the plain text and 112 is the ciphertext, I can probably figure out then that your function is n times 8. And so if I've broken your encryption scheme, I figured out how to reverse your cryptography. Well, it's true, yeah, that n times 8 is only one function that I could use to turn that plain text 14 in this example, turn that into ciphertext 112 in that example, but there are other ways you can do this. My actual function could have been n times 10 minus 28. So 14 is 10 times, so 10 is 140 minus 28, that gives us 112. And there are other, again, many other contrived examples that we could try to do pretty much the same ad infinitum, just to define the ways to transform 14 into 112. It could be all sorts of ways. And so just because you do see that 112, it doesn't mean that you figured out how to break my hash function. Like, you haven't figured out what my encryption technique is. All I say is, here's a black box that I would like you to feed some input into. Even if you do see the output, or more concernedly, an adversary who sees that output as well should not be able to, or cannot see into this case, could not undo it. Because yes, I have been using n times 8. Like, I could have been using this crazy thing involving the n squared, and that's the kind of idea behind public key cryptography. It could be anything. So I'm going to publicize that I have a function that can be used, but I'm not going to tell you what that function is. And I'm certainly not going to tell you how to reverse it. So public and private key cryptography is actually two hash functions where the goal is to reverse them. We kind of talked about this, these hash functions as they're supposed to be irreversible, but the distinction is that we are creating two functions, okay, f and g, which are intended to reverse one another. So it's not that the function does the single function that's reversible. It's the fact that we have two functions that, working together, they create a circuit. If I take data in and I run it through a function f and I get some output out, if I run that output through functions g and I get back the original data, I would have then deciphered that information. And the same thing works in reverse. So if I take some data, run it through the function g, and I hash output that makes no sense, if I get that hashed output and drag it back through function f, I get the original data once again. Clear in, clear out. So now that key is, pun intended, like the key is that one of those functions is public and the other one is private. One of them is available to anyone, public, and everyone uses that function to send you messages. And if I want to send me a message using encryption, using public and private key encryption, you take the message and you use my public key to encrypt that message, and then you send me the result of that encryption, okay, the hashed encrypt result. And then I, kind of in my kind of hidden space here, I use the private key to decrypt that message. I am then ostensibly the only person who has my private key, even though I broadcasted, made my public key widely available. And so the maths that goes into this is well beyond the discussion that I'm not going to talk about it today. But basically, most encryption, most cryptography involves the use of prime numbers, particularly very, 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 very large prime numbers. And again, if you're looking for prime numbers that have a particular pattern, and when I say you're looking for it, don't worry, you don't have to do this yourself. Like, there are plenty of programs out there, RSA being a very popular one, that could be used in order to generate those public and private key pairs. But the amazing thing is that it can generate those pairs really quickly. It's almost impossible to break or figure out what the underlying functions is, or even in this case, what the underlying two prime numbers are that are the foundation of your very own encryption strategy. There's a great video on Computerfile that does this. He does this by diluting juices. So visually, if it helps, I'm going to send you a link to that particular thing. Let me have a quick search. Where is it? Oh, RSA, not audio. Is it one this one? I would suggest watching that video if that's of interest to you. The way that he explained this with pictures, with like juices, how you're able to write those prime numbers and sort of, you cannot reverse, the colors out of a liquid once it's been mixed. That's kind of what I'm alluding to here. And all the while never actually being broadcast into the public internet. So well worth a watch if that's of interest. So again, just to explain, we start with a huge prime number. We start some other prime number that has a property, a special property related to it. And from those two prime numbers, we generate two functions whose goal in life is just to undo whatever the first one does. So F's job is to undo what G does, and G's job is to undo what F does. And this is called public and private key pairs. So your public key is really some complicated hash function that does work. Your hash function is represented as a very long string of numbers and letters. It just looks like a hash digest, but it's it's just a human representation, a readable representation of some mathematical function, and your private key is the same. So your private key is also a representation of letters and numbers. It's not exactly the same as your public key, but it undoes the work that your private key does. So again, these are generated by using a program here called RSA. Tom Scott does a great video of this called the Two Generals Problem, which, looking at the time, I'll briefly watch, if that's okay. Hopefully that's not a copyright strike. The Two Generals Problem. I'm not going to watch the whole video, just trust that.
September 2018. I was tired, I was exhausted, I just got back home from something, and I didn't have the energy to cook. So on my phone, I opened up certain food delivery app that's popular in the UK, and I ordered pizza. Now, I know that food delivery companies' employment practices are questionable. There are more ethical ways to get things delivered, but I was tired, I was hungry, as are a lot of their drivers. But that was the night of the multiple orders, when a bug hit that happened, that some people around Britain ended up with identical food orders being delivered 2 or 3 times, and others got to nothing at all. And I got caught up in the chaos. To explain what happened, I need to tell you a story about two generals. The Two Generals Problem is a classic of computer science. It goes like this. Picture a valley. In the middle of the valley is a heavily fortified castle. On the edges of the valley are 2 armies. The generals of those armies know that the only way they can win a battle and overwhelm the castle is if they both attack at the same time. A single army isn't going to make it. They need the combined strength from both sides of the valley to win. And the only way they can communicate is by sending messengers on a risky path through the valley. And General A won't know what the right time to attack is until everyone is already in position. How can those two generals coordinate to make sure they attack at the same time? This is a magical computer science problem, by the way, so reasonable suggestions like semaphore or telescopes don't apply. On the surface, the problem seems trivial. General A can just send a message to General B with the proposed time they got. But the messenger has to pass through the valley, and if they're spotted, they're not going to make it to the other side to deliver the message. So how does General A know that General B received the message? The messenger might not have made it. If that happens, A will attack, B won't, and they'll lose. So maybe they're rigged it so that General B has to send an acknowledgement back, and General A will only attack if that acknowledgement arrives, but that now runs into the same problem. How does B know that A has received the acknowledgement? It doesn't get through, A won't attack, B will, and they'll lose. So General A can send another acknowledgement for the acknowledgement, but how do they know that that message is comfortable? General B can send an acknowledgement for the acknowledgement for the acknowledgement, and so on, and so on, and so on. This problem is unsolvable. I know it feels like there should be some hacky workaround like sending 200 messages, and sure, that will probably work in the real world, but this is magical information theory and computer science line. Under these strict rules, there is never a guarantee, there is no certainty, no arrangement can be made, there is no way that the two generals, two computers sending data, can agree that the message has definitely been received and acknowledged. Now, with computers, you're not usually dealing with such high stakes. If you are in computer science and work on problems involving potential loss of life, I really hope you aren't watching a series called The Basics.
Okay, so the fact that he's explained what is actually TCP, right? What he's done is he's explained the TCP handshake, the three-way handshake process of, with high probability, we can't know for sure, but just 3 is the minimum that we would like to get on with our lives and actually send the acknowledgement back and not have to rubber stamp this any 4, 5, 6 times onwards, because at that point it just becomes more time and more delay and more jitter. I think 3 is that magical number of it's been confirmed by either party and then also hit that confirmation once more before we can then proceed to send on. And these things are, that's why I made a case before of saying I don't really like the word never because you can never really be 100% sure. There is always that corner case where I could go off the rails, but we're trying to deal with probabilities here. And so, again, just to look exactly how this works, and we would go do some asymmetric encryption using public and private keys. So here we have, let me just explain. I have some original data. This is some data I'm trying to pass in. Dear Ali, I have received whatever, okay? So it's a message I want to send over the internet, and I want to send it to you. If I want to send this message to you, but I don't want to send it to you in the plain text, in the clear, so to speak, I don't want you to, sensitive information, I don't want to send it by plain text. And so I don't want to use a generic hash function because if I use a generic hash function like SHA, for example, it's irreversible. You would then not be able to figure out on your side what I wanted to say. Like, it would just be jumbled up. So instead, I'm going to take my original data and I use your public key. This is your public key. How can I explain this better? I'll say that this is you, okay? And you have a public key, which I'm taking for my own. And I, on the other hand, this is my original data, my file, which I'm using your public key, which again, just a very complex mathematical function. So I translate my data, I feed it into your public key, your public hash function, we've seen, and I get some jobbled up, mishmash out of this. Yeah, okay? And this is what I send off to you. I send you this garbled stuff. Now, in order for you to figure out what the original message is, what you're going to use is your corresponding, well, not your public key, because your public key is what I used in order to encipher this information, but you use instead your private key, your secret key, which is only known by you, hypothetically. It's in your pocket. This private key has not been distributed to others. So this private key, because of the kind of correspondence between the two, thanks to RSA and the like, this undoes all the work that your public key did. And so if I give you my scrambled up data and you use your private key to try to decipher this message, you will then get back that original message, that original data. Now here's the great thing: no one else's private key would be able to do this. If anyone else in the story here, if the yellow person, so if someone else other than us, and that private key,
very bad. Come on.
Pop that on mute there. So if someone else in the message, or if some other amongst the
No, just go. It's a nice stuff coming. Nice stuff coming.
Pop your mute there if you don't mind. So what I'm saying is, if someone else was along the internet being able to encipher your message, or really just using your public key again, if someone else gets a hold of your public key, they're not going to be able to decipher my orange message that I sent over to you. And so public and private keys are quite interesting for that reason, because they create these pairs. There's a pair, there's this unique combination between these two keys that are unique again to two people, or really just even between one person, to Blue in this case, so that if I were to send me a message back, and you would then use a message using my public key, like if you have to just mirror this in reverse, if you wanted to send me a message, you would send me typically a message that's been encrypted with my public key, and then whatever the encrypted sort of scrambled up data is, the message that you want to send back to me with my public key. I would then use my corresponding private key, which is again not known to you or anyone else, hypothetically, anyone else to decipher what it is you sent over. So this will give me back that's why it's asymmetric, okay? The perhaps not so secret sensitive message that's sent over is hidden. That's the idea of asymmetric. Like, you can encrypt using someone's public key, and anyone can do that. And for that reason, like, you're going to find some more technically minded people sometimes post their public key literally on the internet, such as that anyone who wants to send them a message using their secure channel can do that. And some programs do. Like, if I'm doing some work on GitHub, service available for like sharing and posting source code, if I want to send something from my computer to GitHub service in the cloud, I might authenticate using a public key and private key encryption scheme so that they see that I'm using their public key to send them information, and they're decrypting it. Not at all, I'm afraid. No, Poly is a speech synthesis tool. Poly is simply, I think we might have got wires crossed. This is what Poly is. Text to speech. This is what Poly is. I'm just going to choose random voice. I'm going to go for Mizuki.
This is what Poly is.
So Poly is just a text to speech. Yeah, exactly. What we're seeing here is that was a thing I did, by the way, if you want to check that out. I love showing that one off. So what we're actually seeing here is a part of a communication strategy typically restricted by private keys. So again, the point is that this key, again, pun intended, is that, Raymond, you want jumping in a lot. I'm not too sure if you mean to, but I might have to keep an eye on that, okay? So the whole point of these keys is that they undo the work that they wanted in the first place. Now, interestingly enough, it's not the only thing we can do with public and private keys. So instead of just using encryption, we also have this idea of digital signature, which is what we... Yeah, I'm going to put it in the waiting room. I don't think it's actually really here, so I think there's a trouble in paradise. Like to the point of what we saw with Shattered, where they were able to do with like a signature between two people, negotiating contracts perhaps between like a higher rent and a low rent. We have this idea of a signature, which is different from an e-signature, by the way. That's not what I mean by a signature. Like an e-signature, where it's really just tracking the pen, typically like something like this on a surface, and then just looking wherever the pen strokes happen to be. That's what we call an e-signature. I'm talking about something much more complex than that. So that's not what this is, okay? We're talking about something much more cryptographically based. We're talking about a digital signature, which is kind of the opposite of encryption, if you want. Because when we're using someone's digital signature, what you do is you verify the authenticity of the document and verify, again, more precisely, the authenticity of the sender of the document. And we'll explain this in detail again in just a moment, but the basic idea is that we're going to sign off the document using a private key. Again, the whole point is behind all this is you don't see what that key is, and because these public and the private key pairs are specific to an individual person, if you're able to verify that the document could have been signed by someone else's private key, then you have quite a serious belief then that that person is the person who signed the document, who sent the document and so forth. So digital signatures, they are really, really long, like 256 bits, meaning, so there are 2 to the power of 256 power distinct digital signatures, which again just makes the potential of forgery here something about grains and earths and so on, okay? It doesn't even matter. But again, I'm just using this to avoid using the word never. Never say never, because people doesn't like it. But effectively, there is like no chance of forgery, yeah, in practice. Now, for the process of how one verifies the digital signature, like there's a few steps involved to this, and I have a diagram again that I sourced from online. And so what I'm going to do now is show you the diagram. I'm just going to walk through the process to hopefully give you an understanding of how these work and how you might be able to rely then on these signature patterns, okay? So states and again, different entities, different organizations are recognizing digital signatures as a valid way to sign documents. In fact, I think I did one recently with DocuSign. Yeah, I'm not going to show you because it's sensitive, but I have like there's programs by which you can validate this stuff. It really helps to have a good understanding of what is, you know, such as that you, as an architect, as an engineer online, you're comfortable with the fact that these things do represent a specific individual. So let's chance the lottery. The way that this works is we start with our data. And if I just change my pen to something a bit clearer. So data from this document, I mean, in this case, it could be a document, but it could be a video, it could be anything. We're just kind of keeping it simple to say a file. Perhaps it's like a scan or a digital version of some PDF or some actual signature. But again, the whole thing is just scanned. The next thing is for us to use a hash function. Again, the hash function is, we could use in this context, it could be anything. It could be SHA-1. It could be something much more complex. But in general, that hash function that's going to be used here is actually not a cryptographic hash function. It's going to be something like MD5. You know, so something that everyone has access to. And that is going to result in a hash. So we get out of this a hash, a set really of ones and zeros. So in the case of MD5, it's going to be about 160 different characters. And now where things get interesting is when we take that hash, that's set of ones and zeros, and we encrypt that then using the signer's private keys. Remember, these functions are reciprocals of each other. So a public key can undo what a private key does, and the private key can undo what the public key does, asymmetric. Notice in this case that we're not sending anyone our private key. We're not giving you this, okay? We're just using the private key in order to encrypt something. And so we take this hash that we received from our file through MD5, we encrypt this again with our private key, and we get some other results out of this. This number, this comes out of running the hash through that private key. That's called the signature. We then couple this. So when we send this off, we send the signature plus the original document, and that would be then considered together a digital signature. So that's the signing part of the process. Like that's where we go. We start with a file. We run that file through a generic hash function. So not our public and our private keys. That's something that's generally pretty accessible, like an MD5. We then take that hash. We encrypt that with our private key to get some other hash that looks quite similar. You know, different zeros and ones, but totally different patterns of zeros and ones. We then attach the original document and the digital signature together. We send that off, and that's now considered a digitally signed document. So now the real crux is, how do you then prove that I'm the one who sent you the document? You know, right? Like if you're receiving something that does have a digital signature, you know, which is supposed to be as good as any other kind of signature, like it's supposed to have some legal effect, how then do we verify that the person who sent you the document was actually the right person, the correct one? Well, that's why then we have this verification step here, which is why we start. Okay, so we've now received, so dovetailing off the previous bit, we've got this digitally signed data. So this is the same as the digitally signed data that we had that was sent by the sender. We also received two bits of information. We got ourselves a document. So this basically this data here, that's the original, remember this, you get that original document, plus we received a signature also. And recall again that this signature is what happens when you take the hash of the document and you run it by using our private key to get that result. Now the interesting thing is remembering that the public and the private keys are reciprocals of one another. So we can take this really complicated hash and we can use the public key this time, which again is made publicly available. And so anyone should ostensibly have access to someone's public key, like not the private key, anyone should have the public key, right? And notice so that the signer, you never sent anyone the private key. The only time it was ever used is initially to encrypt some data, but they never sent the private key. The private, it's always been the public key, which was available online, you know, at the bottom of an email. So we take that signature, we run this signature through the public key function, and what we get then is a hash. So we take that document, and we take that data, and we run it through MD5, the same hash function that the sender was supposed to use again, and we get a hash. Now, we're checking then to see, we're trying to make sure that do these two hash values equal each other? Are they the same? Do we have a match? If they are equal to each other, then that means the signature is valid. So to think about why would that be the case? If we're using MD5 as a function to this file, so MD5 being the generic hash of this file, okay, and we encrypt it using our private key, we get some results, yeah? Okay, but this is quite easy to calculate. So it's MD5. We're taking a basic document, we're running it through a publicly known, a well-defined hash function. So anyone who has access to this document and the program on the computer called MD5 can literally run a document through this and get a number. Now the tricky part is this, is when you take the hash function, so when you encrypt it with our private key, we get some kind of secret number. The public key is kind of undoing this. Remember, the public and the private keys are reciprocals of each other. So whatever one does, the other one can undo. And so my public key will then undo the work of my private key. So if I take the value and I encrypt it using my private key, and I run that same through value through my new function, I should get the original result again. So that original MD5 hash. And that's why then we have to send the document as well through as well. That data has to also appear, not just the additional, not just the signature, you know, the numbers that we want to get by running through our private key in the first place. That's why we have to validate that, yes, that file has a checksum, and that sender took that checksum, they run it through their own private key, and the one that I used in the public key to undo, we get the same value, which is really just essentially proving, you know, it's a term that we'll say, but very likely proving, yes, that this person is the one who claimed to have initially sent that document, you know, is the person who first sent that document with high probability. And so that's what digital signatures are for. Like, it's a mathematical, it's a cryptographic way to verify that the identity of the sender of the document, of the individual, you know, or whatever context you might be using receiving digital signatures, is purely just a verification step that is entirely based on maths. And so that's another potentially interesting use of signatures, is that, you know, that's quite buzzy now for sure, is this of the blockchain. And I think we've just got enough time to squeeze out an example, okay? Because signatures are really if we understand signatures, you now understand how blockchain works and why it's trusted that as a centralized source of information for people. Understanding signatures, digital signatures, means that you're now in a position to understand blockchain. And so I use the term the blockchain, but it really is a blockchain. Like there's no such thing as the one blockchain. There are many different types of This is just an idea that's implemented. Generally, we're hearing in the context of loose of cryptocurrency, but it doesn't have to be restricted to this. Although cryptocurrencies are just so they're so discussed in the media, that have been dissected by so many researchers. They provide such an interesting vehicle, an interesting lens through which to consider blockchain. And so, if I can get around to it, my example is going to focus on Bitcoin, perhaps the most well documented of the cryptocurrencies, like the most well documented implementation of the blockchain, the most well documented implementations. But it's not specifically about Bitcoin, okay? Just using Bitcoin as a lens through to which to understand blockchain technology, okay? So what I have here is an architecture, and this is another source I would absolutely encourage. I love this guy, 3B1 Brown. I would strongly encourage you to check him out. It's a channel on YouTube. He provides really interesting discussions around topics, and he does a great job at explaining Bitcoin pretty well. So this is another resource I would hope you consider again if you want to consider maybe dig or understand this a bit more, because I guess there's a few more technical details here that, for the sake of hopefully a broader understanding, I just want to get around to tonight. But again, if you want to dive into this more deeply, that is a resource that I would absolutely recommend. Okay, so. I really like talking about Bitcoin in the context of blockchain too, because it's kind of how I started with this in the first place. When I would fund some of my income at university, say, like I would buy and sell mushrooms, which I would collect in the woods in West Yorkshire, and I would sell it to my friends out on the internet. And a friend actually introduced me to this. He told me that I would get paid for selling mushrooms in Bitcoin. And I had no idea what he meant. I really didn't know anything about Bitcoin at the time. I looked it up. It sounded interesting, and I said sure. So I learned how to set up an account on Bitcoin. Worth mentioning again at the outset, like as we're talking about cryptocurrencies, you don't need to understand how Bitcoin works to use Bitcoin. You don't need to understand how the Bank of England works to use bank. Same is true for Bitcoin. But I did end up accepting a Bitcoin payment and creating what's now known as a Bitcoin wallet. And I immediately sold that Bitcoin wallet that I received, turned into cash, and I wish I hadn't done that now. But anyway, so Bitcoin sort of provided me this forum to understand kind of the dark web and maybe make more, explore other fields of technology to which I am passionate about now. So kind of an interesting segue for me to share that with you now, talk about Bitcoin. So just stepping away from Bitcoin again, more to the world of technology. So what is a blockchain? This is very, very similar to something you probably already learned about with me, which is that of last week of a linked list. So remember that a linked list is really just a set of nodes, each of which has connections forwards and backwards to other nodes in the chain. And they are linked together. And again, similarly with blockchain, all of the blocks are chained together, which is basically the same terminology, a bit modified. Okay, so a linked list is just a set of nodes, each of which is connected to the one prior and the one after it, like a chain. So we learned last week about linked lists and having generally three pieces of information associated with them: a previous pointer, which is basically just a reference to the prior node, or in this case, like the prior block, and then we have the next pointer, which is that a reference to the address of the next node or the next block, plus also the the data itself. So in this case, that data is actually two different things. There's the real data, and again, in the context of cryptography, like in cryptocurrencies and blockchain, we're going to talk about a list of transactions, a numbered list of transactions from person A to person B, and each of those transactions being digitally signed, such as that you can now verify that the person who logs that transaction is actually the one that made that transaction too. And that's also something called the proof of work. And so this proof of work is really interesting because that's how Bitcoin ostensibly derives its authenticity. Like there is no central controller for the Bitcoin currency. There's no person in charge. It's very decentralized. And so there needs then to be some way for people to agree as to what the true ledger is, what the true set of the transactions that have already happened are. And the way that that's done is by relying on something that's known as proof of work. And to get into that as well. So again, cryptocurrencies, that data is the ledger of transactions, each of which is digitally signed using the digital signatures technique that we just discussed by the person who made or initiated that transaction. And that ledger is decentralized. And so that means that anytime that there's a change, anytime that someone buys or sells something, a transaction is recorded, in this case, again, using Bitcoin, again, I'll lens through into the blockchain, that message is then broadcast out. So if I make a transaction in Bitcoin, if I pay you £10, I'm then going to announce to everyone else who has Bitcoin or a Bitcoin wallet, who is monitoring that list of blockchain, that list of transactions, hey, please add the following transaction to this list that I, Marco, paid you £10. And I'm announcing that to everyone who's listening. Everyone records that in their ledger, and some stuff is going to start happening. So, Anka, thank you very much. That's nice to hear. I'm just going to tidy up the points here, because it would make more sense to consider in the bigger scheme of things, but do for yourself to see yourself off. Thank you very much. To address what the issue is, I suppose, like, how do I know it's not a lie? How do I know that the blockchain is not fabricated, that's legitimate? How do I know that my copy of what's being said is the truth? How do you know that your copy of the blockchain is accurate with respect to all the other transactions that are going on? Because there's no central authority. We all are keeping a copy of this. Everyone has their own copy of the transaction. It's decentralized. We all maintain, anyone who's using Bitcoin maintains their own copy of the blockchain. So the question is, how do we defend against people modifying the blockchain? The question is that. So the way that many cryptocurrencies do that is just to assume, and this is defined in the paper, like the way that cryptocurrencies do this is to assume that the chain that has the most computational work put into this is the true chain. And now this is a completely arbitrary decision, okay? There is no reason why one needs to be better than the other one. But this is something that has just to be agreed on by collectively all the users of Bitcoin, is to say, like, in the dispute like if we're disputing something, between which person's claim is the accurate one, which is the de facto definitive list of the transactions, we're going to go with the one that has been verified the most times. And again, this is kind of, the word verified is sort of a sketchy word as well, because there's nothing inherently about proof of work or anything else that proves a transaction has been taking place in the way that we normally think of the word verified. But what am I looking for? rather though, we have a, there was really, there's the one I was thinking of. So we then need some form of standard, this collective standard amongst all the people by which we all agree to, or which to then adhere. So that the person that's making these transactions, if I have a look at this one, for example, or that the blockchain that has the most proof of work put into this is in the list. Okay, that is just something that we must subscribe to as users, as consumers then of the blockchain. Now, how do we then determine that the most, so which version has the most computational work put into it? Which copy then of the blockchain ledger has the most computational work put into it? Well, that is what we call proof of work. And I'm trying to find that here. There you go. So if we, like this proof of work is how the correct blockchain of all the copies of decentralized is then determined. So just to go back and remember how like hashing works, like hashing allows us to take any arbitrary data, run it through a hash function, get an outcome. That outcome is going to be, let's say, 2, 5, 6 bits, each of those bits being 1 or 0. A lot of combinations in there too, but some of them will be very unique. And then what we can, the way that Bitcoin works is, Bitcoin's blockchain works is to prove a particular block. So we're going to ask people, they're often called miners. And that's where the term comes from, is because they're kind of mining. Okay, ultimately, the reward for doing that proof of work is they're going to receive some Bitcoin as a thank you, as kind of like a gift, as sort of generated out of thin air. And so these people are generated, called miners, because we're asking anyone who has a computer to hash that entire block. So hash the entire list of transactions, the reference to the previous block and the next block. And remember that all that is contained within a single node of this blockchain. Basically, and we're looking for a really unusual pattern. So the most recent blocks in that case. We're looking for maybe like the first 30 blocks or the first 40 bits or the first whatever to be, say, all zeros or something. And that's really weird, but like it's a really difficult pattern to find. And the only way we can really do this is just to guess. So you take this entire block and you attach a single piece of data to the bottom of it, like a 1 or 2 or 3, and then you can just count it in that many ways, just trying to by guessing. And so if you hash the whole thing together, you do eventually find a block, when hashed in this way, that produces a very unique pattern. And if you just say, well, here's the number that I then attach, and then let's say I took all the entire block that came before me, and then I hashed it out with a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 was a number. It's very difficult to find a value that would create this unique pattern of 1s and 0s, this particular, 30 zeros in a row or something. But it's very, very easy then just to verify that someone has done it. Just to verify that someone's done it, all you have to do then is really just, they announce the number that they used. They used maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as their proof of work. And that's what proof of work really is. It's just, that's the number that they had to use to figure out, if they announced that and you hash the block with that number, then you can verify, yes, that pattern is actually 30 zeros in a row. So I guess you've proven it. Now, I guess like this is really arbitrary, like it seems kind of weird. Why would you spend all your time trying to figure out a very specific pattern that exists somewhere? That's an answer that I can't answer other than just say that's the standard by which people have described to when Bitcoin came about, that the standard that put out there in the paper, that's just being agreed to, that's the one that we're bound by. The person in Bitcoin who finds this number, 30 zeros in a row, is proving then the validity of all the transactions above it. And so that gets kind of interesting when you think about someone trying to perpetuate like a fraudulent, like a bad transaction, right? Like a bit of a foe. Because if I'm trying to scam someone, or maybe like insert my own fake transaction by initiating a transaction that says, you're going to pay me £100, and then I'm going to announce to you that, you're going to pay me £100, but I don't broadcast it to everyone else who maintains the block. Like I'm just maintaining my own copy of my own blockchain. Well, what kind of interesting, because I think that you've spent £100, as far as I'm concerned, you've sent it over. It says it right here on my ledger. But no one else is aware of this. Like, it's my personal copy of the ledger. So no one else thinks that you've sent over £100 to me. They all think that, I'm actually £100, you're £100 wealthier than I actually think you are. The problem then comes about that I need to be able to verify that block. I need to verify that transaction. So I'm going to append that transaction to my own copy of the blockchain because I'm the only other person other than you, maybe the two of us who have, say, 3 copies of the blockchain. But everyone else, I didn't broadcast the transaction to, so no one else knows about this. In order for us to have the proof of work attached to it, in order for it to be considered a valid chain, I would need to prove that block. I would need to find that secret number that, when hashed with all the entire block before it, that would then produce the consecutive 30 or 40 0 bits before anyone else does. So that's 1 in 2 to the 30th power, chance, because I'm looking for a pattern of 30 consecutive zeros. That's 1 in 2 to the 30th power that I'm doing in order to find that pattern. And I have to find that pattern before anyone else does. And in the meantime, other transactions are also flooding in on the ledger. Other people constantly, like how many people are using Bitcoin, they're also broadcasting their transactions. And I have to keep adding them to my ledger and keep proving that work over and over and over and over again. All the while just trying to stay ahead of, so that my scamming transaction is considered ultimately correct to the blockchain. Now, odds are like, you just can't beat the odds of this. One bad person just trying to add a fake transaction on the blockchain, they can't stay ahead. The rate at which it's coming through, they can't win this ever. It's like a whack-a-mole. Find the secret number, over and done with. Eventually, some of the chain, which does contain the valid transactions, the one with the most amount of work, will win out over any fake attempted fraudulent chain. It will, and what they do is they just disregard it, they just throw it out. No one will consider the less trusted chain to be part of the valid chain anymore. And so that's kind of how this works. Like, again, it's just the arbitrary way that we decided to resolve or how to verify the blockchain. There's nothing about the process that proves that A sent person B money. It's just a consensus, really, that we've decided, well, the people that have gone through the effort to try to find the secret numbers, the miners, the people trying to do this. This one chain is longer than the others because, again, it's been verified. Again, using this word verified, it's been proven with work over and over and over and over again. We're just trying to agree that that's the right one. So again, it's kind of strange. Like, and I would refer you back to that 3 brown, 1 brown video to get into some of the more technical details about this. It is phenomenally well illustrated, to which to consider which one's valid. Okay. All right, so I think maybe that would be a good point to wrap up, if only because I'm looking at the time and it is late on night. So, long story short, the longer the chain gets, the more likely it's considered, verified, legitimate, should we say. I think to not please have any more of your time, I think what we'll do is we'll kind of wrap up that session right there and then, because it's late and I do have a work tomorrow as well. But all these things that we talked about today are possible because we rely on we rely on so extensively on cryptography. We use computers to send information securely, to encrypt information, and that mathematical unlikelihood of someone being able to duplicate our work or suddenly reverse engineer this encryption is what gives us the confidence to make those transactions in the first place. And so cryptography forms the basis of almost anything we do online when we talk about security online. But ultimately, cryptography just relies on maths. So the moral of the story is probably this: like, if you're probably never going to be implementing your own version of the blockchain. You probably are never going to implement your own protocol. You really don't need to understand this completely in order to use this. Like I said, you can use Bitcoin without having to understand the mathematics of Bitcoin. Okay, just like you can use a bank without knowing the minutiae of how the banking system works. The point of the blockchain is just to remove a central authority. We don't rely on one person or one entity, one government to determine what has happened, what the transactions are, like you would with a bank. So your ledger is like your bank is a ledger for everyone else's accounts. With blockchain technology, we are decentralizing and making it so that everyone has access to all the information all at once. And then it's everyone's responsibility, more people buy into this, just to keep that ledger accurate. And because those ledgers are they're relying so much on cryptography, because again, this technology relies on cryptography, we can then use that power of cryptography, the fact that things are really difficult to reverse engineer mathematically, to verify that yes, these are the things that have happened, these are the transactions that have been logged, everyone knows about it all at the same time, and we're all secure as a result of it. And I would, again, encourage you to have another look at that video. It is so well put together. I'm not doing it justice to how clever the blockchain really is. So I'm going to leave it there. If nothing else, you know where to find me. Thank you again for the session. Nick, it's been a pleasure. I know we're going to see each other very soon on Tuesday. And on this too. No, I think I'm seeing anyone tomorrow. But I will see the rest of you next week, folks. I think what we'll do is we'll talk more to the tune of RSA and how this works in the cloud context too. But we're building up a picture here. I hope it works. Thank you very much, folks. It's been a pleasure. I'll see you when I next see you. Manpreet, Ahmed, Raymond, Ramana, Trinidad, Manuel, Binami, Mohammed. Take care, everyone. I'll see you soon.
Thank you. Good night.
Pleasure. Thanks a bunch. Take it easy.